All right, so welcome to this seminar on governing climate change adaptation lessons from the ground, hosted by DIIS, the Danish Institute for International Studies. My name is Mikkel Funder, and I will do a little bit of the introductory stuff here. This is the program that we have for today. As you can see, we've got 1 hour and 15 minutes. I'll start off with a bit of introduction, and then we will have 3 presentations by Francis, Rama, and Beatrice from Ghana and Kenya and Tanzania. And then we'll have a panel discussion towards the end with some further inputs from Johannes, Lily, and Espen. And then lastly, we will have a Q&A session. So please use the Q&A button and facility if you have any questions, and we will try to follow up on some of those. The research programs behind this seminar today are actually 3. The Rights and Resilience Research Program, which works in Kenya, led by the University of Copenhagen and the University of Nairobi. The Governing Climate Mobility Program, which works in Ethiopia and Ghana. The Governing Adaptation Finance for Transformation Program, which works in Tanzania and Kenya. All of these programs are funded by the Consultative Research Committee for Development Research, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so thank you very much for that. Now, I want to say a few things to introduce the topic of adaptation here. There is a fundamental question, which is how we should live with climate change impacts. And that is really the adaptation question. Normally, when we discuss climate change, we talk a lot about mitigation, about stopping the emissions, about stopping further climate change from happening. But actually, we very rarely ask, at least in public debates, how should we actually adapt around here, in this place, wherever you are? Adaptation is very often treated as a technical exercise, as something that is done by government agencies, municipalities, but in fact, it is a very deeply political activity. It deals with very fundamental aspects of our societies, with livelihoods, with mobility, with use of natural resources, allocation of funds, and so on. And philosophically speaking, but also very much in practice, it deals with the future. So how should societies adapt, and what kind of livelihoods are possible for us in the future? We can also see that adaptation is an arena for broader political struggles now. We can see that in some countries. It has been shown in research that it is a means for states to control people and resources by intervening and governing resources, and as we will hear later, the mobility of people. But it can also be a means for local institutions to assert their legitimacy and claim authority and say, we are the ones who know how to deal with climate change because we are the ones who are living with it every day. So we know something about adapting here. And then, of course, there is an awful lot of what is sometimes called autonomous adaptation going on. So individual people, households, communities, especially in the global south, who are dependent on natural resources and adapting all the time on their own initiative. And the interactions of all these different attempts to govern adaptation can lead to very unpredictable outcomes, actually, sometimes of policies and projects. So what does good adaptation look like? Well, there is a developing normative debate about that. There are the locally led adaptation principles to which a large number of organizations around the world have signed up, including also mainstream organizations, governments, and so on. I'll just very quickly go through them here. There is a principle of devolving decision-making to the lowest appropriate level, addressing structural inequalities and what is sometimes called marginalized groups, providing predictable and patient funding, investing in local capabilities, building a robust understanding of risk and uncertainty in local settings. There has to be a flexible programming and learning. There has to be transparency and accountability, and there has to be collaborative action between multiple actors. So we have these developing debates about what good governance looks like. And then there have been a number of approaches, trying to devolve adaptation, trying to link decision-making and financing on adaptation to local government structures, for example, in some of the countries and programs that are seen here. In some cases, even trying to scale that up now beyond actually piloting. So stuff is happening. But adaptation is not just about setting up particular organizations or creating organograms, as this somewhat long quote shows from Huitema et al. In a good article in Ecology and Society about adaptation governance. It is really also very much about how all the different actors and their different interests and their different power relations and their efforts to adapt actually interact in everyday practice. And from that, you can see sort of the real governance, the real on-the-ground everyday governance emerging in adaptation. And that is what we are really interested in discussing today in particular. We think that in order to be able to develop and support adaptation governance that works for all, we really need to learn what's going on at the ground. So we've got these three interesting presentations that each present different perspectives, different dimensions on adaptation governance. We have a presentation on the governance of climate mobility in Ghana, which explores sort of the adaptation governance that is done through projects, through interventions, and how people respond to that. We have got a presentation on the governance of land in Kenya, which looks at governance through policies and laws and rights and how that plays out in relation to people's adaptation policies in practice. And then we've got the governance of adaptation finance in Tanzania, which is about the governance through the allocation and control of adaptation funds. So these are the presentations that we're going to hear today. And I think I will now ask Francis to start putting on his slides. And while Francis is doing that, I can perhaps just introduce him. So Francis Jarawura is a lecturer at the University of Development Studies in Ghana. And he's working on the dynamics of adaptation and rural livelihoods and migration in Ghana. So Francis, please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Michael. I'm happy to share with you findings from our project in Ghana, governing climate mobility. So this is a project that we have spent time with in collaboration with researchers from Denmark and researchers from Ethiopia. So we started in 2019 and concluded in 2024, still doing a few bits to patch up. It's a novel approach that attempts to link governance, mobility, and climate change. So more specifically, we try to look at how governance contexts and interventions shape climate-related mobility, and how local contexts and how other players act and how they shape people's decisions to move. So I'll tell you about the context more specifically. So in Ghana, we selected two sites. So the Upper West region, that is in northern Ghana, bordering Burkina Faso. And we also selected the Eastern region, which is in the southern part of Ghana, which represents a different context from northern Ghana. Northern Ghana is dry zone, as located in the savannah. It has a single maximum rainfall, and of course, livelihoods are based on rain-fed agriculture. It has high persistent out-migration and high levels of poverty. This is opposed to the other side that is forested, has a much more fertile soils. It has a double maximum rainfall, that allows cultivation to take place in 2 seasons, thereby reduces the risks that are involved in rain-fed agriculture. Then, of course, it also receives many migrants that come from northern Ghana, who are also looking for jobs in the dry season and who also go there to seek job and food in times of climate crisis. So we employed a mixed method methodology. So we first assess climate change and variability by looking at meteorological data over time, over 5 decades. Then we also conducted a questionnaire survey in 2020 that gives us some quantitative data of 804 households. Then we also had some qualitative interviews, key informant interviews, and some focus group discussions. We'll discuss some of the key findings around these themes, climate change, vulnerability adaptations, and some of the lessons that we have learned from the project. So, looking at climate change and variability, when we assess data for 5 decades, we realize that temperature in the 2 sites show a clear warming trend over the last 50 years. That's from 1970 to 2020. And in the forest zone, we saw that the temperature increased on an average of 0.027, whereas in the savanna, the increase was 0.023. So then we are able to conclude that temperature change is faster in the eastern region, which is forested. That's interesting, but this has also been a site for intense logging since 1950, as Ghana tried to earn more income from foreign exchange, but it's also been an area that has seen a lot of illegal logging over time. So in terms of rainfall, we have seen significant deviation of annual rainfall values from long-term means of about 1,000 millimeters in the Upper West region. So the rainfall data also shows extended periods of rainfall deficits, particularly from 1980 to 1990. This is also a period that we remember that West Africa experienced serious droughts to the extent that most countries had to receive food from Europe and United States. So we also see that the rainfall distribution from the year 2010 has also been a bit below the mean. So when we look at the eastern region, we also notice that, of course, rainfall patterns there have been much better. And of course, the 1980 to 1990, the droughts that came, they did not really ravage that zone as much. So we can see also that there's also been some bit of reduction in the rainfall for the period. When we come to look at some of the key issues that surround adaptation, we have found that between the 2 steady sites, adaptive capacity is much higher in the forested eastern region than in the savanna. So this has also come at the expense of faster land degradation in the eastern region, that is the forested zone. There has been huge exploitation of the thick forest, and we have seen, rather in the savanna, huge out-migration to the eastern region and other places in southern Ghana that have better climates. So we have seen, in terms of migration, a more complicated migration landscape that's unfolding over time. So we have seen, of course, rural migration has increased with rural-urban migration, of course, also urban-rural migrations. And we have also noticed in our data return migration by northerners who were in southern Ghana and some located in the eastern region due to the degradation of the forest there and the lack of jobs in the farm sector there because of some changes in rainfall and also some other transformations. So some of these changes mainly reflect both old and new patterns. We have seen some new patterns, particularly in northern Ghana, where women have established new routes of migration, whereas this did not exist. And we have also realized that migration is much more secular than seasonal, as previously reported. And that wet season migration is becoming even more important, whereas the literature has mainly focused on dry season migration, where rural people move to urban areas to seek job opportunities. here we now find that more households that are in degraded, find themselves in degraded zones and poor rainfall areas are moving into forested areas with better microecologies to then settle there. They stay for 4 to 6 months, harvest their crops, and then they return. So agricultural extensification is really getting on, and this is also leading to maladaptation in a certain sense, because you see also high levels of degradation in an environment that is already very, very risky. So we have also found that weak local institutions are at the forefront of adaptation, which does not help much. So for example, there's better clarity of land governance in the forest zones. Land is family owned, and it is clear how the land is distributed from one generation to the other until the last parcel is given out. Now, more equitable distribution is what they experience done in the savannah. This is because of modern misinterpretations of traditional land tenure in the savannah, that's the Upper West region, and also appropriation by family heads and elites who capture and try to exploit the opportunities presented by neoliberal land commercialization that's going on. We also find that local institutions have not quite changed over time. Of course, these are not static, they do change. So in spite of all the efforts of NGOs and government over time, male dominance ensure that women have very limited access to land. And where they do have access to land, oftentimes it is infertile land, overused lands. So this is also an important issue that affects adaptation. Poor state governance is very, very important, and we see the state performing very poorly in terms of infrastructure for adaptation, and also in terms of mainstreaming policies that have been made from the national level. So people at the local levels have poor understanding of these policies and also have poor resources to implement this. We also have encountered poor climate development policies and approaches. And of course, they still have some narratives that do not go well. So for example, some policies that we have in Ghana reject migration as an adaptation strategy and try to establish migration schemes in northern Ghana to actually literally prevent people from migrating. So rather than seeing migration as an opportunity, as a strategy that can help households adapt and actually advance their livelihoods. So some of these approaches do not really work well, and evidence shows that they have not worked well. Then poor approaches by non-state actors, mostly NGOs and also other bilateral organizations. Failure to understand or appreciate the sociocultural context have led to many failures of many projects. And this is something that we really want to take a bit further. Then poor or no coordination of state and non-state actors. Many NGOs do what they want to do, and the state knows not what they do or does not care. So there's no collaboration. And one is trying to subsidize fertilizer. The other is seriously trying to ensure that people use inorganic organic fertilizer, and there's no collaboration. So who is going to buy all the produce that comes from a farmer that struggles to use manure? Then, of course, elite capture of state assistance has been one of the key factors that we have tried to explain in our research. So assistance from climate strategies from the national level comes down to the local level, and suddenly big men and big women try to capture them, and the poor farmers stay at the same level. So what lessons do we have to share with our findings? We note that local institutions are not well in tune for certain modern tailored adaptive mechanisms. For example, land use planning is very important when it comes to climate change, and also community adaptation plans. But however, these cannot be executed until we have a better understanding of land tenure, and we can do a bit of social engineering around land tenure. So land is seriously fragmented. and this does not easily allow for land use planning. So we are stuck there. An inequitable distribution of state assistance, and sometimes this is done along colonial strategies. So certain chiefs and certain opinion leaders are first given a tractor, so some are given inputs, and then that is to ensure votes to a government, but then, and to keep the people from really resisting. We suggest that we need deeper and honest reflections with local people on what is needed in taking decisions on both incremental and transformational changes, as we have encountered some NGOs that have insisted on transformation as an agenda to ensure climate change adaptation and resilience. But sometimes that is not what will work, as we see what people tell us. Sometimes incremental changes are better. So we need an honest reflection about what is needed and what can work. Then we also see that if you ignore local knowledge and energies, projects would fail, especially for plant adaptation. Then, of course, not only is institutional change required, but efforts to safeguard enabling elements of the existing institutions is very important, because they are constantly evolving, and neoliberal tendencies and other drivers are pushing traditional norms far, and we need to see what we can keep and what we can change and change better. Then we need the state and local leaders and people to better understand climate change. And we can all do this together. And then I think accountability is something that we need to also ensure when it comes to climate change adaptation. Then we can achieve much more. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that, Francis. Thanks for these interesting comments. Also, I think your last point there about accountability is quite important. So a lot of funding is coming into adaptation projects, but the results and who is actually responsible for delivering these results and living up to the promises in adaptation projects is something that I think we see is often not really very clear. And there are some interesting accountability procedures that could maybe be discussed more and brought into to adaptation projects, where communities, for example, could provide feedback on are we being given and delivered what these projects have promised, for example. So thanks very much for that. So I would like to now pass over to Rama. And Rama is a PhD student towards the end of the PhD at the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Nairobi, and also at the Department of Food and Resource Economics at the University of Copenhagen. And Rama has researched the connections between law and land rights and climate change adaptation in Kenya, including the Community Land Acts, which is interesting and which I think she will talk about now. So over to you, Rama.
Thank you so much, Michael. Just to start by saying that part of the work that I'm going to share today, this brief presentation, is part of a broader project, the Rights and Resilience Project in Kenya, which has been working in close collaboration with the University of Nairobi and other actors in Kenya, as well as the University of Copenhagen, DIIS, which Michael is part of, and Roskilde. And this work has been broad in terms of land rights and resilience and climate change adaptation. But the piece that I'm going to share is what we have been worked closely on as with the Eben Nathan of Copenhagen University and Karuti Kaninga of IDS Nairobi. And this is on the land law reforms and the Community Land Act in Kenya. So looking broadly and thinking about the implications of land rights for pastoralists, climate change adaptation, and more specifically from my PhD research on lessons we can learn on how communities engage with some of the policies that are presented to them by governments. So this short presentation will start by a short background about land rights in pastoral areas and some ideas about how this links with adaptation. Then I'll talk briefly about how land is managed in these pastoral areas and make some introduction about the Kenya's Community Land Act. Then there are some specific issues which I could share for consideration around governing land rights, on subdivisions of land happening in the rangelands in Kenya, some ideas about institutions and adaptation, and the inclusion of communities in this sense. And I will and by some considerations or implications and lessons from our research. So I'd like to start by saying that the question of land rights and adaptation in pastoral areas is important because pastoralist access to land is an indispensable right among pastoralists, for the obvious reason that pastoralists depend on these lands as a source of their livelihoods, traditionally, to date, and the lands that they occupy are also the basis for their long-term resilience. So for these 2 points, then the rights of pastoralists are embedded in their livelihoods through the land that they occupy. And as Francis was talking about mobility, this is the lands that they use to manage their livelihoods or their modes of production. But in the current context and from our research, the rights of pastoralists have continuously become uncertain. They are no longer predictable as they used to be, and there's also the question of diminishing pasture and even land with the closure of grazing corridors, if you think about mobility. And then there is the biggest question about the infrastructure in these arid and semi-arid lands of Kenya. And I think this point applies to the broader Horn of Africa and many pastoral lands in Africa, where we see that there is large-scale large investments, there is massive land subdivision, which is attributed to many reasons, which I'll talk about. And of course, land sales and all these bigger land rush questions. Other researchers are talking about the land grabbing in these areas, both previously colonial expropriation, post-colonial land expropriation by state and large companies. And I think this is also leading to massive conflicts. So just to say that the land we are referring to among pastoralists is diminishing, and it's also affected by climate change, which is our topic today. So just to give this I don't want it to be very depressing, but just the context within which pastoralists are able to manage their livelihoods and to draw on to the different resources for their resilience. So with these dwindling resources and the diminishing land, as we have talked about, we can also reflect on how pastoralists have managed their lands over time as part of the background, and to say that most of the lands have been managed communally among pastoralists. So this is an integral part of how pastoralists have been able to access, and share through reciprocal arrangements. We also know that the management of this land has happened through customary institutions. And even where the state has intervened, there have been mechanisms through which communities regulate access to land. And some researchers have paid attention to how this seemed to have worked. We also have some doubts from the evidence we have about how some of this could have left out groups of people within pastoral groups. But the point being that pastoralists have managed this land communally. And over time, especially in Kenya, and I think globally, and thinking about sub-Saharan Africa, there's been a rush and a push to introduce formal land rights among these communal lands. And there's been a debate about whether formalizing these lands is equitable to, or is a direct assurance for securing these lands. And these reforms have also led us to ask the question whether this formal recognition of pastoral lands implies that their lands will be secured and therefore great for their adaptation and therefore their resilience. So going to specifically Kenya's Community Land Act, the Community Land Act, in brief, just for background, is that the law, which came into place in 2016, alongside the Climate Change Act, by the way, recognizes communal land for the first time, first through the Constitution of Kenya in 2010, and also has aspects of devolving land governance. And at the same time, recognizes customary tenure as ways of governing this land. So when we think about how Kenya's rangeland, semi-arid and semi-arid lands occupied by pastoralists are to be managed henceforth from 2016, then we think about these community land governance systems that offers some ideas about inclusion. But less positively, there have been heightened contestations from our research about, since the introduction of this act. There have been land conflicts about ownership, And then there's also been increased calls for subdivision, which we could call an unintended consequence. Some people would say this is surprising, given that this act comes in to secure communal land, but then it ends up pushing communities to seek subdivision for some reasons that we have found or made the point elsewhere in our research. So this is just to show the difference between what a communal piece of land would look like and a subdivided piece. But that doesn't mean that all subdivided pieces in pastoral rangelands in Kenya look like the photo on the right, that my right or could be your left, where there are enclosures and fences. That is not the feature of subdivided lands all over. But we make the point in our research that this process of boundary making and demarcating land eventually leads to these enclosures, even if it hasn't reached there yet. So this leads me to the considering the point about subdivision and thinking about how the subdivision of the rangelands is leading to a lot of diminishing space for pastoralism as we know it. But some people may also see subdivision as an adaptation. Indeed, our research shows that with the diminishing pasture, then communities are increasingly thinking of enclosing and sharing this subdivided land, like as research by Maya from Kajiado shows. But then there's a question of what subdivision does to the communal sharing that I've discussed before, that the institutions of managing this land are disrupted, and so the modes of adaptations are equally disrupted. We could say that they transform themselves or they change, but then there is the question of whether this land fragmentation could continue supporting pastoralism as we know it. But in terms of adaptation, we've also seen that there are opportunities for individual ranching, changing forms of herding, and rearing of specific animals that would suit those forms of land tenure with the changes. Then I would like to make a point about the institutions on land and how those also affect adaptation. So if the government, both at the national level and at the county level, are in charge of governing land, and this law that I'm referring to, the Community Land Act, provides opportunities for local management of land, how do these institutions interact to respond to local adaptation needs? Our research finds a disconnect between these national and county roles in supporting these promises made in the Constitution and in the Acts. And therefore, this affects the adaptation strategies that exist in these communities. So we see these practices and the knowledge among the communities affected by this institutional incoherence and lack of cooperation between these institutions. And these siloed roles, as we call them, affect even the responses that come from these institutions. For example, when you think about the purchase of hay during drought, there's no policy support for this. And in this case, we can ask the question, who is in charge of adaptation needs among pastoralists? We can think about the different roles allocated to different offices, but the adaptation one becomes ambivalent, at least from what we found in Samburu in Kenya. So this ambivalent role of the state and its agents affects the ways in which we can govern land to support pastoral adaptation. This also brings us to the point about inclusion. So I think Francis also made the point from Ghana about how traditionally, or what we've seen before from previous research, about different communities being left out in these pastoral communities because they are not homogeneous groups, they are not all equally able to access land. But the community land law, in this case, provides for these specific avenues of inclusion for women and youth who have traditionally been left out. But we also observe that this provision of inclusion runs parallel with existing models of decision making in these communities that we study among pastoralists. So for instance, we create avenues of inclusion for women and young people. The previous system allowed the male heads of the households to be the group, like the members who represent the community. So then there's the community existing structures of age sets where younger generations anticipate to inherit land. So in this case, we see communities among pastoralists where older generations held land in trust and handed it over down generations. So with these new laws, this is disrupted, and then the process of handing down this land is no longer there, especially when we think about subdivision. And that also could help us think about the avenues of adaptation that come up out of these processes and some that diminish or are threatened. So if inclusion is an opportunity for adaptation, it can also be an opportunity for some struggles within the community. Speaking about inclusion, then we can think about pastoralist women. And one of the things we found in our research with pastoral women is that these processes of subdivision or the changes within the land laws are providing the women an opportunity to think about some other adaptive strategies and therefore building on their resilience. So if the women in this case said they would prefer to stay at home and they thought that the forests and the faraway places where their sons would go out to look for pasture were dangerous, then they thought that this idea of having subdivided pieces would work better for them to make use of the land. Then there's the question of the avenues through which people or members in the community who would not have land anyway, based on the previous way in which land was managed communally before the law, would buy from those who own land after a subdivision process, and therefore make different adaptation strategies and diversify their livelihood through this process. So this is just to show that there are many implications for pastoralist groups, and this is one that we found for pastoralist women. So the broader question is about the law, at least as it is on paper, and then the practice, that is the reality on the ground, and adaptation needs among pastoralists.
You may want to start rounding up now, Rama.
Yes, I should. Because then we see that outcomes of legal frameworks can be counterproductive. And I think what we see as some key lessons, I think, which are important here is if the law is to facilitate pastoralist adaptation, then it needs to be able to display and nurture attributes of resilience and adaptation. And the law should also be flexible and responsive in a way that it maintains and reflects community needs. I think the main point here being that we need to think about the linkage between the governance, adaptation, and the policies of at different levels, including land policies. So I have some key lessons on adaptive governance here, which are similar to what I have talked about, including how locally led adaptation and green transition discussions need to center land rights. And we have different pieces of work that refer to some of these points, which I have put up here. And we can also share those on the Q&A. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, Rama. And thank you very much for bringing up this issue of how access to natural resources is really important for adaptation in many rural, but actually also urban and peri-urban areas, and how the wider governance frameworks around that access are very important to people's adaptation. If people change their livelihoods and they develop new adaptation strategies, they have to be able to access land and natural resources to actually support those adaptation strategies. So I think this is a really important issue that you're bringing up, and thereby also illustrating, of course, that we need to think about the governance frameworks that are outside the sort of normally very narrow technical field of adaptation. So thank you very much for pointing that out. So we move now to Beatrice Soumari's presentation. Beatrice is a PhD student at the Institute for Resources Assessment at the University of Dar es Salaam, and she's studying the governance of devolved climate finance in Tanzania. So Beatrice's presentation is about the sort of critical question of the governance of the allocation of funds. So please, Beatrice, go ahead.
Thank you, Michael. I'm happy to present to you some of our research from the GAP program, which is governing financial adaptation for governing climate change adaptation finance for adaptation in Tanzania, Kenya, and this is part of it, and the University of Dar es Salaam is part. This is a brief format of my presentation. I will start by talking about introduction, where I will tell you where climate change adaptation financing comes from in Tanzania. And I'll move to how decisions of using such finance is made. But also I'll talk on how such decision making is impacting the local level. I'll talk on the challenges of governing adaptation finance, and also I'll conclude by talking on the key lessons of governing climate change adaptation. In the introduction, I'll start by showing this quote from one of my respondent from the central government official who said, Tanzania does not believe that it contributed to the changing climate, so it does not commit its resources to deal with the same. So this means Tanzania does not commit resources to adaptation initiative, but it relies on donor funds to do the same. Since the signing of Paris Conference, the country has been receiving climate change adaptation finance from both multilateral and bilateral institutions. And when you come to Tanzania, climate change adaptation finance reflects power politics and balance of powers within the central government. Tanzania system is also very centralized, where all decision making is made at the central level. And some findings have found that when the system is such centralized, it's likely to result in efficient use of resources. Now, how are decisions made for using climate change adaptation finance in Tanzania? As I've said, the power rests within the central level. Climate change adaptation financing in Tanzania is centrally financed, and this has resulted to availability of limited availability of funding for climate adaptations and interventions at the local government. Our study by GAP last year showed that only 44% of climate change adaptation financing is devolved to local government authorities. And once these funds are devolved, they are always tagged with strict guidelines to implement central government prioritized projects at the local level. When you look at the funding, it shows only 5% out of 44% is the one which local government authorities have decision-making power over it. And when you do calculations, you find only 2%. The local government can decide of only 2% of adaptation funds. And these funds include TASAF fund. TASAF is a social action fund, which is a World Bank funded project, one of the biggest climate tagged adaptation finance project in Tanzania, with highly devolved decision-making power to the local level. So let's see how, when decisions are made at the central level, how does it impact the local level? First, there's rigid budgeting framework that fails to align with the local government on development plans. So it blocks the local government capacity to autonomously plan and execute projects. But also it results to inadequate capacity, both personal and technical, but also lack of exposure, especially to climate change issues, because all the actions are happening at the central level. For example, all proposal development, training programs, and the policy development are happening at the central level. But it also results in dependency, because the local government actors are just there waiting for guidelines from the central level. They are waiting for decisions to be made for them at the central level. So they are quite dependent. But also it results to lack of resources, and local government in Tanzania cannot borrow money without getting approval from the central government. Due to this, also, they don't plan for climate change adaptation. For them, climate change should be financed either by the central government or it's a donor responsibility. Let's look at this quote from one local government official who said, "We don't plan for climate change adaptation because of shortage of resources. Our own source is very limited and only sufficient to run office." But also planning of projects in Tanzania at the local level is done through O&OD. O&OD stands for Opportunities and Obstacles for Development, which is a planning approach which was established by the government for the purpose of transferring authority to the people, involving and giving them power to participate in planning and implementation of development programs within their areas. It was also meant to make local government authorities more autonomous. However, this was not transferred because the process is predetermined by the central government priorities. In this process, the communities are asked to come with their priorities, which are termed as a shopping list. And once the communities come with the shopping list, it ends up usually cut down because of limited resources. But before also coming with the shopping list, the communities has to wait for the guidelines from the central government. So the shopping list should also align with the central government priorities. Now, let's look at the challenges of governing climate change adaptation finance in Tanzania. First, there is lack of clear demarcation between climate change adaptation and other actions. For example, we don't have specific climate change adaptation fund, and there's no climate change adaptation finance code, which will help tracking of financing for climate change adaptation, which also seems to discourage some donors because of lack of transparency. But also, when the climate change adaptation finance arrives in Tanzania, it ends up to the Bank of Tanzania. And the process of getting that fund from the Bank of Tanzania down toward the project, it seems to be very long. Let's look at this comment from one central government official who said, "The government process is very bureaucratic and cumbersome. It delays climate change adaptation finance to reach the communities, which also prevents us to combat climate change urgently." But also there is low level of awareness among key actors. For example, some local politicians associate climate change with God's wills. One local politician said, "Climate change is a natural calamity, so I cannot use it to ask for votes because it's out of my control." There's also political interference from politicians, both from the central and local level, who interferes with implementing activities. Some of them interfere with implementing unplanned activities, both for political gains, but also one local government official said, "We are serving political masters. We must do whatever makes them happy." And this doing whatever makes them happy sometimes ends up implementing unrealistic projects. Now, what are the lessons we have learned for the governance of climate adaptation finance? These are two pictures from two different project sites in our case study areas. The first on my left, this one here is a warehouse project which was implemented by a central government in a top-down or one-size-fits-all manner. This is inside the warehouse. Years after its implementation, it was never used because it turned out that the community did not want a warehouse because actually they didn't have anything to put in the warehouse. And this one is on my right side is this one here is a devolved project. This is a flooded farm in one of the villages where the villagers access this TASA fund, which is highly devolved. So they decided to implement this contour project to curb the flooding. And this picture is 1 year after the implementation of the project. This is the wall to direct the water. Now let's look at the quotes from these two different projects, what the people were saying. From the warehouse project, the people were saying, "This project was an order from the central government. Oh, if I had given a chance, I would not have chosen the same project because if the project was functioning, it will only benefit a few people." Or others will say, "This project is not suitable in our area, it's not beneficial." Contrary to the contour project, the beneficiaries were saying the flooded have been reduced by a big percentage, or the soil fertility has been restored, there is increased crop yield, or our road is now passable. Now the lessons we have learned. First, tailored and contextualized approaches are crucial. This is because local communities have unique vulnerabilities, resources, and capacities. A one-size-fits-all approach to adaptation projects does not work. Participation and decision-making of beneficiaries a must. Because apart from building a sense of ownership and sustainability to adaptation projects, engaging local stakeholders, including community members and the local authorities in decision-making processes, enhances their effectiveness. Capacity building of local government officials essential. We have found that the local government lack technical expertise and resources to effectively mainstream climate change adaptation in the development planning. Another thing is mainstreaming climate change adaptation in development. Climate change should be integrated into broader local development planning and budgeting processes. The last thing is flexible financial mechanisms needed. Local contexts are dynamic and climate impacts can change over time. Adaptation financing mechanisms should be flexible enough to adapt to evolving needs and priorities. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for this interesting presentation. Quite interesting to see some of your quotes. I like the one about the politician who couldn't see any votes in climate change because it was beyond everybody's control anyway. Also interesting to see how small a part of the climate finance that is actually under the control or actual decision-making power of the local governments. Very interesting. So I think we can see coming out from these three presentations that, and you all highlighted that, there is still quite a long way to go in terms of sort of creating an alignment between government central level and the local institutions. As I mentioned briefly in the presentation, we still have, or we do have a variety of programs that have in recent years tried to support local governments and local institutions, including the Local UNCDF programs, including the Kenya County Climate Funds, World Bank projects in various countries, and of course, a large variety of NGO-supported and funded community-based approaches. But there is still very clearly some way to go before we're actually sort of getting to the point where local institutions are really have the lead in this process. So we will go now to get some insights and some comments from our panel. I can see that we are missing Johannes Atela. So I think instead we will see if he joins later, and otherwise we will move on to Lily. Lily, we would be interested to hear if you have any observations. You have, of course, been involved in the work with Francis and the GCM project. Lily is a senior researcher at DIIS and working on the governance and politics of climate change adaptation. So Lily.
Thanks, Mikkel, for the introduction. And it's also a pleasure to be able to give comments after the presentations that we had that really give insights from three different contexts and three different aspects of adaptation. So before we go into kind of some of the cross-cutting things that I think come out from the presentations, I think it's useful what Mikkel just mentioned, that we actually have a long way to go. And that's actually a quite important starting point when you're talking about adaptation governance. So if we're looking at adaptation generally, I mean, it's something that there's been an increasing focus on in the last about 10 years especially. So, you know, in this last 10 years, before we had more focus on mitigation, we've shifted our focus to an increasing degree also to adaptation. But in that time, this governance aspect, it hasn't necessarily been at the core of our focus. And I think one of the things that we see from all the presentations is how essential it is for adaptation, successful adaptation, that we have an understanding of the governance dynamics and considerations at play. So that's kind of our starting point. And all of this is coming at a time when, you know, we're seeing around the world catastrophic climate events now. We're seeing those slow onset climate events intensifying the variability and the change in rainfall and temperatures that are making life increasingly difficult. And a lot of the gains that we've seen in development around the world being put under strain, and livelihoods put under strain, and really, you know, giving questions for policymakers, for implementers, and for communities and households on the ground about what their futures might look like. And so trying to understand this governance dimension is just crucial. So a few of the things that I took out of the presentations, one of the first is this disconnect that we're seeing across levels in a variety of ways. And so we saw that in terms of the policies and the finance, that we're not seeing, you know, even though that we've started looking at or considering, you know, the policies at a national level, these have become increasingly robust over the last several years in a lot of countries, but being able to see those and mainstream those and implement those at lower levels concretely, that's something that we're still not as far in. The issue of knowledge and priorities. And so one of the things is these nice policies and everything coming down, but the knowledge and priorities that we see at lower levels, and that can be from local communities. We also talk about from specific groups. It can also be from lower levels of government that have insights into particular contexts. And that information is not always getting sent upwards. And then we also have one of the things that came up, Mikkel also noted, was about accountability, for instance. So we also have these mechanisms of governance that aren't always functioning in a way that actually really support adaptation. And that came out in a couple of the presentations as well. And there was something on enabling environments and so on. So that what mechanisms of governance, what kind of characteristics do we see in governance that can enable adaptation? And so these are some of the things that we often talk about in terms of governance. You have, when you talk about, you know, these levels and the kind of vertical integration you talk about between levels, and then you start talking about also horizontal integration of all the different actors at a specific level that need to be kind of on board if we're going to have successful adaptation. So those are some of the terms that we've been hearing. At the same time, when you're looking at the local level, what the presentations also indicated is that there can be unintended outcomes. Anybody working with implementation knows that that things can get messy, or, you know, you can even end up with a very well-intentioned and, you know, at on paper well-formulated project having sometimes negative outcomes. So what is it that we do? I mean, if that's the reality, then how do we address that in terms of governance? And one of the things that we need to consider is, again, I mean, going back to this accountability, it's not just having the structures, but kind of mechanisms that can support adaptation in the context of messiness on the ground, of challenges in implementation. And getting into that, it's not just a question of institutions, because we often think, okay, we're talking governance, we're talking institutions. As Mikkel said earlier, I mean, this is not just about organograms. One of the other things that came out across the presentation was the cultural aspects. So we're not going to be able to separate those two. Increasingly, we're looking at governance when we're talking about adaptation. And that's, you know, a movement from an initial focus more on the technical aspects of adaptation. So we've moved to governance, but I think within that move to governance, we need to probably take a next step, not just from looking at the policies and institutions of governance, but considering the cultural context that we're looking at in a particular area. Because if we're separating those, it's going to, again, be very difficult to have successful adaptation outcomes and outcomes across groups. Because what the presenters also illustrated quite clearly is that, you know, even if we link different levels and we have a very nice vertical integration where we're getting all the way down to the local level and maybe even local priorities up, that we have differentiation within the local levels. We have particular groups that might not have as much access or as much say, and to be able to take that into account in terms of the cultural context so that everybody is able to benefit from adaptation. So those are some of the things that I wanted to bring out, that we have these kinds of mechanisms for institutionalized feedback and input, not just for, you know, a certain level or particular groups, but across groups as well, and linking that to the cultural context and taking that kind of next step in how we engage with governance in adaptation. So thanks again very much for your presentations. And I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Lily, for those points. I think I will hand over quite directly to Espen. Espen is a senior researcher here at DIIS, working on rural development, agricultural development, and has done a lot of work on devolved climate change adaptation. So, Espen, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mikkel. I will take a few words on some of the very interesting presentations. A few comments. It seems that a lot of things, a lot of activities are going on in terms of autonomous adaptation. But when I go travel in Eastern Southern Africa over the last 10 years, I've heard again and again that there's no financial resources available to assist local activities for adaptation. And that's a puzzling as the Paris Agreement agreed that the northern countries should pay $100 billion a year. 22, we reached 83 billion, and something like 15 billion of these have gone to least developed countries for adaptation. And in Tanzania, the GAP program have looked into the OECD database, and between 2013, 2019, and Tanzania received a total of $2 billion for climate change adaptation. So where's this money? Why is there this perception locally that there is no money for climate change adaptation, and still quite a bit of money has been given? And I think if I draw together some of the things Beatrice was talking about, is one possible explanation is that this donor support, these $2 billion, it is based on donors' self-registration of what is climate change relevant, using the Rio Market bilateral organizations and the three-step method for the multilateral banks. However, there's quite a broad leverage for them to register what is climate change relevant. And to be climate change relevant does not mean that it's relevant for at the local community. So to sum up, the donors have become quite good at tagging development programs as climate change, but they have been quite slow in beginning to plan locally led climate change adaptation programs. It's actually just beginning. As Mikkel mentioned, some of them, the Locale, the Floca in Kenya, the SIF programs of the bank. Second point in explaining why climate change finance is not reaching the local government level in a relevant way is the context of the national governance. And in Tanzania, we have a situation of a highly centralized government structure. And the GAP program finds, by analyzing the OECD data and the project documents of the 40 biggest of the programs, we found that, as Beatrice mentioned, 44% of the finance is spent at the local government level, but only 5% of these have been governed by local government. So it's only 2% of the funds which are actually spent and governed following locally led adaptation principles. So that's to sum up there. I mean, the context matter, and this strong state control ends up with a focus on technical solutions, and often, again, not solutions which are seemed relevant for adaptation by local people. Finally, Beatrice talked about the TASAF program. I mean, within these 2%, which are actually governed out there by local governments, there we, as Mikkel also mentioned, that it's a highly political matter. There is a lot of contestation between central government, local government technical staff, and local government politicians, and the village government representatives. So a lot of ambiguity about what is climate change adaptation all about. Gives space for political contestation, and politicians, I find, often take a very negative view of climate change adaptation. They say it's a lose-lose-lose. It's a very complicated. There is no votes in it, and there's no money in it. So context and how to develop capacity at the local government level is really quite important to make it work. But the bad news is that right now a very little of the low percentage of the funds which are tagged as climate change adaptation is really relevant for solving climate change adaptation challenges at the local government level. I think I'll stop there.
All right, thank you very much for that, Espen. Some really crucial points there. I think the point about also that adaptation is so broad and vague for many people makes it also a very contested and politicized space. I think that's also quite interesting. All right, so we're going now to the Q&A session, and I think I will start off by having a question for each of the case study presenters. So maybe we can start off with a question for you, Rama, which brings up another of the green issues, the green agendas, namely that of protected areas. So there is a question here for you, Rama, which says Samburu, which is one of the areas where you have done fieldwork, is bordered by several national parks. Does this have any implication and interaction with climate change adaptation? Perhaps you can provide some comments to that.
Yeah, thank you, Mikkel. I think the question about other land uses in the pastoral areas is an important one, including protected areas. The question about gazetted forests, especially those which were gazetted later, which were the fallback areas for pastoralists, obviously affects their movement, but also affects the opportunities for dry seasons. So that's a direct relation. But I also wanted to say the point raised is also useful in thinking about other land uses, including conservation, which our project looked at, community-led conservation, community-based conservation, and also thinking about how access to land for grazing in these areas changes based on the new governance structures that have evolved over years. So both the state encroachment on this of land in these areas, but also the protected areas and the human-wildlife conflict, just to mention a few. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Rama. Then I actually have a question for Francis. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the connections between migration and mobility and then the adaptation projects that you have studied. Because I think that you have written together with Lily and others an interesting policy brief on some of these connections, and I just wanted to hear if you could elaborate a little bit on what you have found there, maybe.
Yes, thank you, Mikkel. So what we have found is that sometimes there were deliberate policies to deal with some of the challenges brought by climate change to the agrarian sector, and that the fear has been that this risks posed by climate would lead to massive outmigration from the rural areas. This is just as we saw in the earlier literature about climate and migration. You wonder how it gets down at the local level. So this also comes from old policies that have been there for much long and which still finds our presence. So some of the government strategies have been to build dams in the rural areas so that people would have cultivation in the dry season, and then they wouldn't have to migrate to southern Ghana, because migration has been perceived by some NGOs and also the government as having largely negative outcomes and inimical to development. So therefore, we need to stem migration and ensure that young people stay in school and would not have to migrate to the city in Accra and Kumasi, that young people would not have to go to Accra and have to go through a lot of stress. Some young girls come back pregnant, some get raped, some others learn other bad habits. So all this have been put forward in some official documents, and they said, well, irrigation is one of the best ways to keep these rural people down there. Unfortunately, this did not materialize and gave emergence to some new forms of migration instead. So in one village that we looked at, because of the poor construction of this dam, the village gets flooded and trapped. So people cannot leave the village for 3 months. You cannot come in, you cannot go. So the youth would no longer stay to help their parents farm. They rather get out as quickly as they can, so in order not to get trapped in the village. So this has consequences that may be unintended, but of course the important thing is to ensure that the right policies are put in place, and that we get to get governments and different people to learn that migration can be a very useful adaptation strategy.
All right. Yes, important point. So we have a couple of questions for you, Beatrice. One of them is, who decided that 44% of the funds should go to the local governments? And then in relation to that, or an extension of that, there is a question about when you are looking at the finance, are you also looking into other sectoral budgets that are not immediately related to adaptation? Because it can be seen as maybe tagged or budgeted under one budget line, and then you're not in your work capturing other funds that are given in other sectors. So maybe Beatrice and Espen, if you want, you can respond to that.
Yeah, thank you. Those are very good questions. Starting from the one of 44%, who decides it? As I said earlier in the presentation, Tanzania is highly centralized. So every decision is made at the central level. So whatever percentage is decided at the central level. I think I've answered that. And also looking at the sector, if we looked at other sector, Tanzanian budget is sector-based. Yes, that is true. And the project had a chance to visit the sector budgets. And because Tanzania doesn't have a specific climate adaptation finance, we actually had to manually go to sector budgets and look at all the books. And if you have to find which project is finance, is climate change, you have to look at the project documents, and all the projects which were mentioned with climate finance were donor funded. But when you come to the normal planning of Tanzanian budgeting, unfortunately, there's no planning for adaptation financing from the local level to the central level. It does not include. I think I should end here.
If I may add, it's the methodology was we took the 40 biggest of the project out of some 800 and something projects. We took the 40 biggest, which amounted to about 3/4 of the total amount of money. And then we went through all the appraisal reports of these projects and looked at to what extent did the funding appear in the local government votes. So it's you ask who decide that is really the decision of the appraisal reports and the appraisal missions of the various donor projects. Yes, and again, this is tagged by the donor. Some of the biggest programs is the TASAF, which is Social Protection Fund. There's big infrastructure project, big urban projects, which is then tagged as climate change adaptation. And the quality of this tagging is also up for discussion. But the decisions are taken as part of a normal development project cycle, and not specifically targeting climate change adaptation. However, afterwards, it's been tagged as relevant for climate change adaptation. If this explains. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, so we're running out of time. So unfortunately, we won't have time to go through all the questions, but there is one that I would like to pose and to all of you, and if one or more of you would like to just respond to that. There is a question here which is about how should the local adaptation government's arrangements actually look. And as we have discussed already, there are different models and approaches to that. But I would like to sort of specify the question a little bit and say, there is a lot of attention on local governments, so elected local governments. But is that really is that all we need? Or is there also a need for other kinds of local institutions to be involved, other ways of deliberating this question that I started off by asking, namely, how should we adapt here? What kinds of livelihoods do we actually want here? Obviously, they will be different, but where do you discuss that? Is that in the local governments, or is it somewhere else? Perhaps somebody would like to try and give some input to that question.
Yeah, Michael, I just have a quick comment on that to say that recently we've been thinking about demystifying or breaking down the question of what is local. When we say local, that we want to engage local communities, this is something that we have applied in all our work when we say we are working with local communities or we are engaging local representatives. And so we need to think about what exactly local is when we think about even locally led adaptation, whether it's when we've involved local governments or local representatives or local community members or representatives of community members. But a broader suggestion from our research is that there has to be engagement of local communities, ideas and practices embedded at the local level within the broader structures that already exist. So this is just an insight in terms of how we apply the word local and how sometimes local may actually be something else. We can say subnational level so that we can differentiate these terms and what we mean.
Thank you, Rama. Anybody else?
Well, the big new flagships for devolved climate change adaptation is based on performance-based grant principles, taken from how we know that principles from water, from education, from roads, other sectors. And that's basically saying that you can have the money if you behave to local government, and in the sense that you have a climate act and you have a socially inclusive governance process and so on and so forth. So the devil is in the details here, and those details we are only beginning to look at to understand those. But obviously, it's a very different situation in Kenya, where you have the climate change county funds, and now you have the Flocker program from World Bank. And the last many years, since the constitutions, they have devolved their decision-making structures to the 43 counties, while in Tanzania you have a highly centralized governance systems, which puts more obstacles. It will be much more difficult to have that kind of projects in through local governments in Tanzania, because they at least there has to be quite a bit of change and capacity development to implement it there. So maybe there parallel structures will have a bigger success of succeeding. On the other hand, we need to work through local governments, which is the only thing which is sustainable in the long run, and move away from project-based assistance.
Okay. Very good. So time dictates that we end here. I want to thank everybody who has been listening in, and thanks very much also to the presenters. I would urge the listeners to look up the research, the work, the publications of the presenters and of the research programs that were represented here. And yes, thanks to everybody. And maybe this afternoon you can, or wherever you are in your time of day, you can think a little bit about what kind of adaptation do we actually want here in this place. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.